news, of course, for China and Russia and a whole host of other. It's going to be like dominoes, in effect, isn't it?
No, it's not.
No?
There's a certain amount of anticipatory fear around the language that, oh, well, China would be very threatened by the dollar collapse because they would lose all of this supposed storehouse of wealth.
Uh-huh.
But we now know recently that they've gotten to the point where they've reduced their dollar holdings to less than $700 billion. So they're no longer this huge dollar storehouse, and they're using those dollars rapidly. So they are being smart about getting out of the dollar in the background. But there's also another component to this. There's a hidden tax on the whole planet at the commerce level to support the American military machine.
Yes.
Bear in mind that we're 4 to 6% of the global populace, but we spend as much on military as the rest of the planet combined.
Yes.
And that military spending has to come from somewhere, so we basically, if one wants to think about it at a macro level, we tax our colonies through various means to support this giant military machine, very much like the Roman Empire used to do, or any other empire structure, into the Middle East or over into China. And at some point, the onerous burden of that taxation becomes greater than the associated fear of loss of wealth in the empire's currency, and especially when the currency itself is debased, that's at the point that empires crumble. Now, in this case, we don't have a currency that can be debased as such because we deal in so much in the way of digidollars and other abstract concepts. However, we have debased the currency with the production of these fantastic, huge amounts of speculation in the form of derivatives that reputedly are nominally or notionally worth 7 to 8 times the domestic product of the planet. Under those circumstances, the currency that backs those derivatives is basically already bankrupt.
Really? Completely?
Think about it. If the notional derivative values were to have to be paid off at some level, then you're talking about the whole planet having to work for 7 to 8 to 10 years to pay it off to whoever theoretically would own it.
Yes.
The debt, I mean. And at that level, the whole planet is certainly not going to work for 7 years and vigor themselves to pay off our debt. And I don't think the United States populace is going to work for 7 or 8 years to pay off debt at the level where we would have to just scrape by with just, abject total poverty as slaves.
Yes.
In order to pay off the notional values of these derivatives.
Right.
China, recognizing this, did as we thought they would, and we projected in some of our data that around the week of August 16th to the 22nd, some bad news would come out as regard to derivatives and start this next run of release language.
Yes.
And sure enough, about that time, word came out that China has decided that they don't have to pay off on fraudulent derivative contracts, and the language is such that all derivative contracts are basically fraudulent from their viewpoint. And I agree with them. They are indeed fraudulent.
Yes.
So China is basically saying, we're not going to hold up our end of this stick. Or anybody else going to do it?
Interesting. So what are you seeing in the data whenever it surrounds all of this? Are you seeing some interesting things kind of surfacing from the technology?
Yes, indeed. On a couple of different levels, it becomes fascinating because it's also interwoven. So, for instance, we see that we're going to have a real rough year relative to the dollar, and that the dollar is going to be going in, before we even get into the pressure of that year that we say is the actual death of the dollar, we were going to get to a period of time when the dollar would start to be questioned as a global reserve and currency. And just the other day, of course, we had Bernanke being questioned by Congress, and he's basically they're discussing the idea that global reserve currency not being the dollar anymore. And so we knew our temporal markers are on track, and that being the case, it looks like we're going to get to this really interesting year where the dollar dies and the federal government goes into what we call coagulation, and all kinds of interesting stuff comes out of the shadow government simply because we won't be able to afford to keep the shadow government rolling with the dollar dying. Sort of makes sense?
Yeah, indeed. Indeed it does. I know that with, and I've been kind of watching this kind of closely, Because I noticed that whenever a particular news story comes out, whatever the big event is, like things going on with G20, of course, things like this affect the stock market. Up and down, a rumor can send it crashing. And it's a really funny place, the stock market. This I know. But I watched an article today. I can't remember what news source it was from, but it was basically the current administration is pushing to have people refinance their home. And on a personal level, I'm thinking, the heck with that. No, I'm not. No way would I do that right now. If I'm making my payments just fine, even if I am late a little bit because of whatever reason, as long as I can keep those payments and keep my home, why would I want to refinance and put myself deeper in debt? So it made me wonder what's going to happen with the stock market when he says this. And it had some interesting results today. And I thought, the best bet is stop listening or watching any of this stuff, because you really can't get a straight answer out of anybody anyway. So why watch it? Why pay attention to it?
Well, and also, even worse than that, they're using not-so-subtle neuro-linguistic programming techniques in an effort to act as propagandists for the powers that be and for the stock market. We're at a very critical time in the progress of the Depression. This is similar to a period of time just before the bond crash in 32-33, and the previous Depression, which led to the gold confiscation and later in 33.
Yes.
And the seizing of all kinds of assets and so on in an attempt to force hyperinflation and get them out of a deflationary drag. We're about to hit that same period. This is what we call the coagulation on the federal government.
Yes.
When revenues drop appropriately, they'll have to start, either issuing IOUs or laying off people in droves, and there will be all kinds of disincentives to work, because we should be hitting a hyperinflationary period near that same point, such that people on fixed incomes, in the sense of salaried with the government, are going to be hit really hard.
Right.
As in a hyperinflationary period takes over.
Right.
So it's going to be quite the socially chaotic period. Yeah, there's just no getting around it.
So I got to ask you on a personal note, when you watch this, and if you turn on your television or open up your newspaper or whatever, you see the kind of the chaos going on. But looking at your data, you can kind of anticipate it anyway. So it's probably no big surprise to you when it all hits, right?
That's pretty much the case. I actually enjoy surprise when I find it now, because so much of the work seems to take some element of that out.
Yes.
And I also have a tendency to be living about, say 16, 18 months ahead in the future, because that really is the far end of where the data is, and I'm always tracking that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's an interesting sort of a life. That's quite true, because a lot of people will talk about a certain thing going on. It's like, I keep saying to them, well, why are you surprised? You knew about this 2 years ago. Get with the program.
Right, catch up here. Open your eyes. It really is fascinating. Like I said before, whenever it comes to when we have you on the program, the things we talk about, and then sitting back and kind of watching things play out. Now, one of the things that we talked about last time you were on was the aspect of people just vanishing. Can you tell me about that again?
Yeah, we have a key word for disappearances. And the oddity of the whole thing is that it appears to be a long-term thread within the language, in the sense that our forecasts are that the language around disappearances will pop up and then fade away and then pop up and fade away and so on, but that it'll transit through the mainstream media and the independent media over the course of some period of time, maybe 2 to 3 years. And we indeed have seen some of the first ones have actually panned out, in the sense that we had forecasts for disappearances associated with people and yachts and mega yachts and this kind of thing, and a Marie Celeste incident, and those sure are popping up around.
Here's something real quick, and I promised that I would keep an eye on the chat room for any questions that were coming through. And this comes in from a listener out there. It says, I'm a small farmer, and I'm already experiencing people who are preferring to be paid for services with cash and food. How prevalent does Clif expect quasi-barter to get as a means of conducting business?
Well, here's the end result of it all. We're gonna go through a transition. So, excuse me. The problem with making the forecast is it sounds like it's, from this point on, and it really is an evolutionary sort of a thing.
Yes.
But we're evolving towards what we call the calorie economy that will relate to energy and food. And that's how people will be paid in basically spare food or spare energy.
Yes.
And at some point, though, we'll get us sophisticated enough that we believe that precious metals will be included within that as a proxy for long-term or long-distance trading of those kind of commodities.
Uh-huh.
But I suspect that it will become the way of getting things done, especially over the course of this next year.
Really?
The dollar death that we've got forecast here, the dollar is kind of a weird currency because it's been kept alive a lot longer than most. It started in 1913, and it won't make 2013 here, so it won't last 100 years. But most currencies actually perish. Most paper currencies perish between 56 years and 72 years, with a couple in the history that have extended out to about 78.
Yes.
But here we are in our long of two 80s, or actually 90s with the dollars. And the dollar crash, in many different ways, or the dollar death, the process of it, we've gone back and looked at it historically in the United States, those periods where previous paper currencies have crashed, because there have been 4 of them in our history, 4 currencies that we've had that just have died.
Yes.
And we're seeing a lot of the same sorts of things emerge. And in between each one, you go basically to a gold and silver economy that is everything's worked around some form of a caloric exchange. I have extra sheep's wool, and I'll trade it to you for you making it into a sweater or whatever.
Sure.
Trade it for canned goods and this kind of thing.
Sure.
Unfortunately, that doesn't really go very well with a huge, giant population. That's all set up to be, I guess, electronically connected and sort of dial it in. So we're going to have something of a social order conflict there.
I visited a gentleman that lives in a small town here in Texas, and he told me that what the entire town, I can't remember how many people, it's not a whole lot of people in this little town, and it really is very small, but they got together independently, and they put together a survival bunker, which he gave me a tour of, which I was quite impressed by, actually. The way that it was done, and of course we wanted to keep the location secret, so I didn't take any cameras or anything. I really wanted to. We tried to talk them into let me just film a little bit of it. No. But the entire town got together and did this, a survival bunker. And I thought, okay, now, has everyone in this town gone completely bonkers, or are they just being smart and being prepared?
They're following the lead of the wealthiest people on the planet.
Oh.
To say that they are smart and being prepared.
Yes?
Because the wealthiest people on the planet have been squirreling away stuff like mad for probably the last 20 years with real seriousness.
Uh-huh.
And look at how much money and effort they put into overcoming every single objection and doing the screwiest international project ever, which was the seed vault, and they did it well, and they did it in an extremely short period of time.
Yes. Which Monsanto went in and started cloning and patenting all the seeds.
Right, which is neither here nor there. My point in the illustration is just that the fact that they built it, where they built it, how they built it, and overcoming all of the normal objections of international environmental groups, etc., and just making it happen finally.
Yes.
Tells you a whole lot about their motivation. So any town that has the smarts to go ahead and prepare for themselves a collective survival strategy is way ahead of the game.
Yeah, and they did it independently outside of any type of city council or anything. They even had